I have a lengthy quote here from Bart Ehrman, whom you may have heard of, in his
I
book
actually know.
Lost.
Go ahead.
Yes, in his book Lost Christianities, and so I'll read the whole thing and get your response. So it may be difficult to imagine a religious phenomenon more diverse than modern day Christianity. There are Roman Catholic missionaries in developing countries who devote themselves to voluntary poverty for the sake of others, and evangelical televangelists with 12-step programs to assure financial success and prosperity. There are New England Presbyterians and Appalachian snake handlers. There are Greek Orthodox priests committed to the liturgical service of God, replete with set prayers, incantations, and incense, and fundamentalist preachers who view high church liturgy as a demonic invention. There are liberal Methodists, political activists intent on transforming society, and Pentecostals who think that society will soon come to a crashing halt with the return of Jesus. And there are the followers of David Koresh still today who think that the world has already started to end, beginning with the events of Waco, a fulfillment of prophecies from the book of Revelation. Many of these Christian groups, of course, refuse to consider other such groups Christian. What could be more diverse than this variegated phenomenon, Christianity in the modern world? In fact, there may be an answer: Christianity in the ancient world. As historians have come to realize, during the first three Christian centuries, the divergent practices and beliefs found among people who called themselves Christian were so vast and fundamental that the differences between Roman Catholics, primitive Baptists, and Seventh day Adventists pale by comparison. Well, Darrell, what's your take on that?
A lot of rhetoric and very little history.
Okay.
Um, uh, the whole point of pedigree, the whole point of writing the missing gospels was to make the point that people who are claiming that alternative Christianity goes back to the very beginning of Christianity have badly misread the early history of the early church, and to try and show that and demonstrate that. And this pedigree question that I'm talking about, the way in which orthodoxy consistently expressed itself through 2 centuries versus the variety of expressions that came from people who took up the Christian name and what I'll call the Christian brand. Um, uh, I mean, in the second and third centuries, excuse me, in the second and third centuries, that variety is emerging and it does exist, but it doesn't go back to the earliest period, and that's the point.
Hmm.
What he says could be true of the second century and the third century, but it's not true of the first century. And so that's where the problem lies. The problem that you had in the earliest Christianity was how Jewish Christianity was going to be, um,
Right.
and so and the false teaching that you sometimes uh, ran into ran into the edges of this Neoplatonism that became Gnosticism, but it wasn't fully developed yet. And um, so you had some variety, but when he tries to suggest that the variety that exists now pales in comparison to what existed early, that's just that is empty rhetoric.
Mm. Mm. Well, so is it the case that this phenomenon called docetism, if I'm pronouncing that right, that is referenced in the latest text of the New Testament, right? In the letters of John, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, and that's the when
Okay,
I said there are elements of
sure.
Neoplatonism that's what I'm alluding to.
Okay, so it would be an argument from silence, but how do we know that there weren't alternative Christianities in the first century in incipient forms that then come to expression later on in the second century
Well,
and third century?
there were attempts to express Christianity differently.
Hmm.
Okay, no one's denying that.
Okay.
Okay, but what you've got are the people who were closest to Jesus saying that is not what we believe, and so you have the emergence of this, but you also have the pushback on it from the very beginning as it's emerging. And that's the point, is that I tell people that there's a line that goes, history's written by the winners, and so the argument is,
Yes.
well, what survives and what the winners preserve is what remains, and they win the arguments about what history is. But there's a retort to that, and the retort to that is sometimes the winners deserve to win. In other words, sometimes what gets preserved is a reflection of what was actually going on. and isn't fabricated. And this is, again, I'm back to Irenaeus again. Irenaeus is important to us for this because what is claimed to have been hidden and suppressed was actually present and we were aware of.
Mm,
It's just we were aware of it from a certain angle. Okay. But that didn't mean that it didn't exist. And the other thing that's going on here, let me say this, is that the brand of Christianity, and I'm going to use public relations and marketing language so this point is
sure.
clear. The brand of Christianity was so powerful that people wanted to embrace it, but they wanted to embrace it in a form that they were able to shape.
Right. And so that's what you're saying, I take it, is that's why you get
That's why you
alternative
get the
forms of
varieties.
Christianity? Yes.
That's why you get the varieties. That's why you get the syncretistic mixes that produce all kinds of different options as to what it looks like.
Well, I do remember when was I probably was like 17 at a bookstore looking through Bart Ehrman's it was his companion to Lost Christianity's Lost Scriptures. And what struck me is that it's very provocatively titled, as is Lost Christianities. But I think that when you actually look at the details, Bart Ehrman isn't really saying, well, at least some of the time, he's not saying anything that you might that you disagree with. It's all about the way you phrase it. And so in that quotation, for example, he says within the first 3 centuries. Right. So that's
Yeah,
technically right if it's only the second
correct.
and third. And I imagine he knows that, but that's not as provocative a claim of saying, yeah, the Christianity we believe in today and recognize that goes back to the first century. It's just after that you get all this diversity. It's
Well,
far more alluring.
I'm reminded of a quotation from a person who was helped produce the production called "From Jesus to the Christ" for PBS in the 1990s. Which was seen by 13 million people when it was released on Easter, and 15 million people the second time, et cetera. So a lot of people saw it. He was a professor of classics at the University of Texas Austin, which happened to be where I went to school.
Mm,
And so, and he says basically, we don't have any text coming directly from Jesus, and nor do we have text written during the time of Jesus' ministry. Okay. Perfectly to suggest we don't have anything that goes back to when it happened. Okay. That's the thrust of that quote.
right.
I there you go. It's technically correct and it's also very misleading.
Mm,
It's technically correct because, yes, we don't have anything from Jesus, nor do we have anything that was written at the time when Jesus himself was ministering. What we do have, however, are works that derive from people who walked and talked with Jesus and who were there at the things that he said and did. And so that's why I'm saying you get these quotes sometimes, and on the surface, technically, they are they are correct, okay,
mm.
but they also are either expressed in such a cherry picked way or in such a mislead with such a misleading spin that you're actually leaving out things that are important to understanding what the actual context is.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I don't think you sell as many books by stating it in the fully correct way rather than the truncated
Correct.
correct way. Now,
Correct.
yeah, and the point I was making that didn't get to make, but about the lost scriptures is that as I flip through the book, there's a brief introduction that uh, Dr. Ehrman writes for each one, and he's honest about when these texts originate, and every single time it was mid to late second century or
That's
later.
right.
And I
That's
remember
right.
thinking, well, am I missing something? Because I mean, on the surface, just as a 17-year-old looking at that, it was nobody thinks that the canonical gospels come from the second century. I mean, as my understanding anyway, most people date it within the first century. And so if
Correct.
there's universal opinion that the Gnostic texts and related texts all come from the second century or later, well, unless something remarkable is going on, they're not going to preserve a better historical reconstruction of Jesus and early Christianity than the canonical texts, right? I mean, that just seems to be a pretty
Yep.
fundamental argument.
Yep. Well, you understood that as a 17-year-old because you were a normal thinking person at the age of 17.